The sound of shattering crystal cut through the upscale restaurant's gentle atmosphere as every conversation suddenly fell silent. Nathaniel Reed, billionaire, single father, and the man who had turned rejecting women into an art form, was kneeling before a girl the matchmakers had chosen as their most cruel joke. Ruby Martinez sat stunned, her small hands trembling on the white tablecloth, still wearing the simple dress she had borrowed for an evening that she thought was more about selling herself than a marriage meeting. The entire restaurant held its breath. Camera flashes flickered. "I know you're very surprised." Nathaniel's voice rang out in the silence, steady despite the chaos he was about to unleash. "But would you marry me?" The man who always turned his matchmaking dates into laughing stocks with the highest contempt was now proposing to a girl of the lowest status, one the matchmaker had supposedly chosen merely as merchandise. 3 months earlier, Margaret Thornfield had been staring at a stack of rejected profiles on her mahogany desk, each one bearing the same humiliating fate. The elite matchmaking center had built its reputation on impossible unions, but Nathaniel Reed had become her greatest failure. 27 women, 27 public rejections, 27 stories that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The latest rejection had been particularly brutal. He'd told the senator's daughter that her laugh reminded him of a dying seal, then left her at the restaurant while photographers captured every moment of her tears. The tabloids had a field day, and Margaret's phone hadn't stopped ringing with cancellations. "Find him someone decent, Margaret." "He can't keep living like this." Helen Reed's voice echoed in Margaret's memory as she picked up another rejected profile. Nathaniel's mother had been pleading for months, her hope dimming with each failed attempt. The woman genuinely believed her son could find love again, despite all evidence to the contrary. Margaret understood the source of Nathaniel's cruelty. 3 years ago, his wife Victoria had left him for his business partner, attempting to take their son Oliver in a custody battle that made national news. The betrayal had turned him into something cold and calculating, a man who viewed every woman as a potential threat to his fortune or his child. But Helen Reed's monthly payments kept coming, generous enough to keep Margaret's business afloat during the economic downturn. She couldn't afford to refuse the woman's requests, even when finding willing participants had become impossible. No respectable woman would agree to meet Nathaniel Reed anymore. That's when Margaret's eyes fell on Ruby Martinez's application, buried beneath months of more prestigious profiles. The young woman had applied 6 months ago, her requirements modest compared to Margaret's usual clientele. She wanted stability, not luxury. A good man who could provide security for her aging parents. Her teacher's salary barely covered her own expenses, and her father's failed investment had pushed her family to the brink of losing their home. Margaret felt a twist of guilt as she studied Ruby's photograph. The girl had kind eyes and a genuine smile, nothing like the calculating expressions of women who typically sought out billionaire matches. Ruby Martinez had no idea what kind of man she'd be facing, but desperation makes monsters of us all, and Margaret needed this arrangement to work. She told herself that Ruby was an adult who could make her own choices. She didn't mention Nathaniel's reputation when she called with the good news. Ruby's reaction had been one of quiet disbelief. "Are you sure he'd want to meet someone like me?" she'd asked, her voice small over the phone. Margaret had assured her that sometimes the best matches came from unexpected places, hating herself with every word. The lies came easily after that. She told Ruby that Nathaniel was a widower looking for someone genuine, someone who could help care for his young son. She painted him as lonely rather than cruel, damaged rather than dangerous. Ruby's compassionate heart had responded exactly as Margaret had hoped. On Nathaniel's side, Margaret had been more strategic. She'd simply told him that she'd found someone different this time, someone who wouldn't be impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his reputation. She'd played to his ego, suggesting that Ruby might actually be a challenge for once. Nathaniel had agreed with the same bored indifference he showed toward all his dates. He'd probably planned his rejection speech before even seeing Ruby's photo. Margaret had scheduled the meeting at Le Bernardin, knowing the upscale setting would highlight the class differences between them. She'd expected the evening to follow the usual pattern. Nathaniel would arrive with his arsenal of cutting remarks, Ruby would realize she was out of her depth, and another young woman would leave in tears. Margaret would apologize to Helen Reed, claim she was doing her best, and collect her fee for the attempt. What she hadn't expected was the phone call that changed everything. Oliver Reed had been rushed to the hospital that afternoon with appendicitis. Nathaniel had spent hours pacing surgical waiting rooms, his usual armor of cynicism cracking under the weight of parental fear. When the surgery was successful and Oliver was sleeping peacefully, something had shifted in Nathaniel's chest. He'd looked at his phone and seen Margaret's reminder about his dinner appointment. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt tired of being cruel. He was exhausted by the cycle of humiliation he'd created, sick of seeing his own pain reflected in other people's tears. His mother's words came back to him as he sat beside Oliver's hospital bed. "You're not just punishing them, Nathaniel. You're punishing yourself." Helen had said it after his particularly vicious rejection of a kind pediatric nurse, a woman who'd only wanted to help him heal. Nathaniel made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him. He would go to dinner, but instead of delivering his usual cruelty, he would propose. Not out of love or genuine interest, but as an act of mercy for both himself and whatever poor woman Margaret had lined up for slaughter. He would offer a business arrangement, a contract marriage that would satisfy his mother's concerns while protecting both parties from emotional harm. 3 years, enough to give Oliver stability and show the world that Nathaniel Reed was capable of commitment. After that, they could part ways amicably with generous compensation for her time. It was clinical, practical, and completely devoid of the romantic nonsense that had destroyed his first marriage. If the woman was desperate enough to date him despite his reputation, she'd probably jump at the chance for financial security. Nathaniel arrived at Le Bernardin that evening with a ring he'd purchased impulsively, a simple diamond that represented transaction rather than affection. He'd prepared a speech about mutual benefit and clear boundaries, ready to turn his latest act of cruelty into an unexpected mercy. Then he saw Ruby Martinez. She wasn't what he'd expected. Most of the women Margaret arranged for him arrived dressed to impress, armed with designer clothes and practiced smiles. Ruby wore a simple blue dress that was clearly borrowed, her hands clasped nervously in her lap as she studied the menu with wide eyes. She looked young and frightened and completely out of place, like a lamb led to slaughter. When she looked up and saw him approaching, her face broke into a genuine smile that made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. "Mr. Reed." "I'm Ruby. Thank you so much for agreeing to meet me." Her voice held no calculation, no hidden agenda, just nervous gratitude and genuine warmth. Nathaniel had been prepared for gold-digging desperation or practiced charm. He hadn't expected sincerity. They'd talked for barely 20 minutes before Nathaniel realized that Ruby Martinez was nothing like the women who usually sought him out. She asked about his son with genuine concern, not the practiced interest of someone calculating her way into a fortune. She spoke about her parents with obvious love, mentioning their financial struggles without any hint that she expected him to solve them. When the waiter brought champagne, Ruby had politely declined, explaining that she'd rather stay clear-headed for such an important conversation. She treated the evening with the gravity of someone who'd never taken luxury for granted. Nathaniel found himself studying her hands as she spoke, noticing the calluses that spoke of honest work and the careful way she handled the expensive silverware. This wasn't a woman who'd grown up in his world. She was here because she genuinely believed in the possibility of finding love, not because she'd calculated the value of his bank account. The realization should have made his plan easier. Ruby Martinez would probably accept his business proposition with relief, grateful for the opportunity to solve her family's problems. But somehow, her genuine nature made the whole arrangement feel more cruel than any of his previous rejections. She deserved better than a contract marriage to a bitter man who'd forgotten how to feel anything beyond contempt. She deserved someone who could love her the way her innocent hope deserved to be loved. But Nathaniel had come too far to back down now, and his son needed stability more than this stranger needed protection from his emotional unavailability. When Ruby excused herself to the restroom, he pulled out the ring and made his choice. The proposal had been as much a surprise to him as it was to everyone else in the restaurant. He'd intended to lead up to it gradually, to explain the terms and conditions like the business arrangement it was meant to be. Instead, he'd simply dropped to one knee and asked the question that would change both their lives. Ruby's stunned silence had stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The entire restaurant had gone quiet, other diners pulling out phones to record what they assumed was a romantic moment. "I don't understand," Ruby had whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden chaos of camera clicks and excited whispers. Nathaniel had realized in that moment that he couldn't explain his proposal without admitting that she'd been set up as entertainment for his cruelty. He couldn't tell her that Margaret had chosen her as the least likely to fight back, or that his original plan had been to humiliate her so thoroughly that she'd never recover. Instead, he'd improvised. "I know this is sudden, but I've never met anyone like you. Will you marry me?" The lie had come easily, but something in Ruby's expression made him wish it could be true. Ruby's acceptance had been quiet and overwhelmed, barely a whisper of yes that somehow carried across the restaurant. The crowd had erupted in applause, and suddenly they were surrounded by congratulations and champagne toasts from strangers who'd witnessed what they believed was a fairy tale moment. Nathaniel had slipped the ring onto Ruby's finger, noting how it looked enormous against her small hand. She'd stared at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real, and he'd felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness towards this woman he barely knew. The contract conversation would come later, in private. For now, he let the restaurant believe they'd witnessed a love story, accepting congratulations with the practiced charm that had built his empire. But as they left the restaurant together, Ruby's hand small and warm in his, Nathaniel found himself wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if maybe, somehow, this broken arrangement might become something more. The next morning brought reality in the form of contracts and lawyers. Nathaniel had his legal team draft an agreement that spelled out exactly what their marriage would entail. 3 years of companionship, public appearances, and help raising Oliver. In return, Ruby would receive enough money to save her parents' home and secure her own future. He'd presented it to her in his sterile downtown office, watching her face as she read through the terms. She'd been quiet for a long time, her finger tracing the lines of legal text that reduced their relationship to a business transaction. "This isn't what I thought marriage meant," she'd said finally, her voice small in the vast space of his executive suite. Nathaniel had steeled himself against the disappointment in her eyes. "It's honest, at least. No false promises, no illusions about love conquering all, just clear expectations and mutual benefit." Ruby had signed the papers with the careful signature of someone who'd never had many choices. She'd asked only one question before putting pen to paper. "What do I tell my parents?" "Tell them you're happy," Nathaniel had replied, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he'd wished it could be true. The wedding had been a small, efficient affair that satisfied his mother's need for propriety, while avoiding the media circus a large ceremony would have created. Ruby had worn a simple white dress and carried flowers from her mother's garden, looking beautiful and sad in equal measure. Oliver had been their only attendee besides immediate family, still recovering from his surgery, but insisting he felt well enough to watch his father get married. The 7-year-old had taken to Ruby immediately, perhaps sensing her genuine kindness beneath the strange circumstances of their arrangement. "She's pretty, Dad," Oliver had whispered during the brief ceremony, loud enough for Ruby to hear and blush. It was the first time Nathaniel had seen her smile since she'd signed the contracts. Helen Reed had been less enthusiastic about her new daughter-in-law's humble background, but her relief at seeing Nathaniel married again outweighed her social concerns. Ruby's parents, Carmen and Roberto Martinez, had been overwhelmed by the entire situation, clearly out of their depth, but grateful for their daughter's apparent good fortune. The reception had been awkward and brief, with Ruby looking increasingly overwhelmed as Helen made pointed comments about proper society behavior, and Nathaniel's business associates offered congratulations that felt more like condolences. It wasn't until they returned to Nathaniel's penthouse that evening that the true weight of their arrangement settled in. Ruby had stood in the marble foyer looking lost and small, still wearing her wedding dress like armor against an uncertain future. "Your room is down the hall," Nathaniel had said, his voice more brusque than he'd intended. "Oliver's is next to yours. He has nightmares sometimes." Ruby had nodded, accepting her role as glorified nanny with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout their bizarre courtship. But as she'd walked toward her assigned bedroom, she'd paused at Oliver's door, listening to the soft sounds of a child trying not to cry. Without asking permission, she'd knocked gently and been invited inside. Nathaniel had watched from the hallway as Ruby sat on the edge of Oliver's bed, not trying to force conversation, but simply being present while his son processed the strange day. "Is she really going to be my mom now?" Oliver had asked, his voice thick with confusion and hope. "She's going to take care of us," Ruby had replied carefully, her hand smoothing the blanket around his shoulders. "And we're going to take care of her too." It was a promise that would prove more prophetic than any of them realized. The first months of their arrangement had been exactly as sterile as Nathaniel had intended. Ruby took care of Oliver with genuine affection, managed the household with quiet efficiency, and attended social functions as his polished, silent wife. She asked for nothing beyond what the contract provided, and offered nothing beyond what was required. Nathaniel had convinced himself this was exactly what he wanted. A wife who wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't make emotional demands, wouldn't threaten the careful walls he'd built around his heart. Ruby Martinez was the perfect business partner, fulfilling her obligations without complication. But somewhere in the routine of their arranged life, small cracks began to appear in his indifference. It started with Oliver. The boy had attached himself to Ruby with the desperate affection of a child who'd been missing maternal care without even realizing it. She helped with homework, listened to his stories about school, and never seemed to tire of his endless questions about everything and nothing. Nathaniel found himself pausing outside doorways to listen to their conversations, struck by how naturally Ruby understood his son's needs. She didn't try to replace Oliver's memories of his mother, but she filled the empty spaces that Victoria's abandonment had left behind. One evening, Nathaniel came home late from a business trip to find Ruby asleep on the couch outside Oliver's room. She'd been reading to him and had dozed off mid-story, the book still open in her lap. Oliver was sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, his nightmares apparently soothed by her presence. Nathaniel had stood watching them for longer than he could justify, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Ruby looked younger in sleep, her face soft and unguarded in a way she never allowed when he was around. She'd given up her own comfort to ensure Oliver felt safe, and she'd done it without fanfare or expectation of praise. It was the kind of selfless care that Nathaniel had forgotten existed. He'd covered her with a blanket and carried Oliver to his own bed, trying to ignore how right it felt to perform these small acts of domestic tenderness. Ruby had stirred as he'd adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes opening briefly to meet his in the dim hallway light. "Sorry," she'd whispered. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "Thank you," he'd replied, and meant it more than she could have known. The cracks in his armor widened as Ruby began to reveal more of herself beyond their contractual obligations. She studied business courses online after Oliver went to bed, her laptop glowing in the kitchen as she worked toward a degree she'd never been able to afford. She sent money to her parents each month from her household allowance, always less than she could have spared, but more than they'd ever had before. She worked part-time at a local community center, teaching ESL classes to immigrant families who reminded Nathaniel of her own parents' journey to America. Ruby never mentioned this work, but he'd discovered it by accident when Oliver had insisted on showing him a drawing Ruby had helped his friend's little sister make. "Ruby teaches kids like Maria how to read English," Oliver had explained with obvious pride. "She says everyone deserves to feel at home." Nathaniel had felt something shift inside him at those words. Ruby wasn't just fulfilling a contract. She was building a life that had meaning beyond their arrangement. She was the kind of person who made the world better simply by existing in it, and somehow she'd agreed to share her life with a man who'd nearly forgotten such people existed. The realization should have made him grateful. Instead, it made him feel ashamed. He began watching Ruby more carefully, noting the small ways she'd improved their lives without drawing attention to her efforts. The penthouse felt warmer somehow, filled with small touches that made it feel like a home rather than a showcase. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, meals were prepared with care rather than duty, and Oliver's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. Ruby never asked for his attention or approval, but she never seemed resentful of their arrangement either. She treated their marriage like a job she was determined to excel at, bringing the same quiet dignity to her role as his wife that she brought to everything else in her life. The problem was that Nathaniel found himself wishing it was more than a job for her. The turning point came during Oliver's 8th birthday party. Ruby had spent weeks planning a celebration that balanced the boy's simple wishes with the social expectations of Nathaniel's world. She'd managed to create something that felt both special and authentic, filled with Oliver's school friends and carefully selected adults who wouldn't overwhelm the children. Nathaniel had watched her throughout the afternoon, marveling at how easily she navigated between his mother's social requirements and the genuine joy of 8-year-olds. She'd made sure every child felt included, every parent felt welcome, and every detail reflected Oliver's personality rather than his father's bank account. "She's good for you both," his mother had said quietly, appearing at his elbow as they watched Ruby help Oliver blow out his candles. "I was wrong to judge her background. Character matters more than pedigree." It was the closest thing to an apology Helen Reed had ever offered, and it made Nathaniel realize how much Ruby had changed their entire family dynamic without anyone quite noticing it happening. That evening, after the last guest had gone home and Oliver had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys, Nathaniel found Ruby cleaning up the kitchen with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. "Thank you," he'd said, meaning to offer simple gratitude for the party's success. Ruby had looked up from loading the dishwasher, her face tired but genuinely happy. "He had a good time." That's all that mattered. "You didn't have to do all this," Nathaniel had continued, gesturing toward the perfectly cleaned kitchen and the carefully stored party decorations. The contract doesn't require you to be the perfect hostess. Something had flickered across Ruby's expression, too quick for him to read. I wanted to. Oliver deserves to feel celebrated. What do you deserve? The question had slipped out before Nathaniel could stop it, more honest than he'd intended to be. Ruby had paused in her cleaning, her hands still on the dishwasher door. For a moment, Nathaniel thought she might answer honestly, might tell him what she really wanted from their strange arrangement. Instead, she'd smiled that polite, careful smile she wore like armor. I have everything I need. But Nathaniel had seen the flicker of longing in her eyes, the brief moment when her guard had dropped. Ruby Martinez wanted more than their business arrangement could provide, and the knowledge made him feel both guilty and inexplicably hopeful. As their second year of marriage progressed, Nathaniel found himself looking forward to coming home in ways that had nothing to do with escaping work. Ruby and Oliver would be in the kitchen doing homework or cooking dinner, their easy conversation filling spaces that had been empty for too long. The penthouse had become a place where genuine affection lived, even if that affection wasn't directed at him. He began joining their evening routines more often, helping Oliver with math problems or listening to Ruby's patient explanations of American history. She never excluded him from their domestic harmony, but she never sought his participation either. She simply made room for him when he chose to be present and respected his distance when he didn't. It was the kind of emotional intelligence that Nathaniel had learned not to expect from the people in his life, and it made him want to be worthy of her quiet generosity. The changes in their relationship were subtle, but undeniable. Conversations lasted longer than necessary. Smiles became more frequent and genuine. Small courtesies evolved into thoughtful gestures that went beyond their contractual obligations. Nathaniel began bringing Ruby books he thought she'd enjoy, carefully selected volumes that matched her interests in education and social justice. Ruby started making his coffee exactly the way he preferred it, even though she'd never asked how he liked it prepared. They began watching movies together after Oliver went to bed, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but sharing the kind of comfortable silence that felt almost intimate. Neither acknowledged these changes directly, but both began to hope they meant something more than habit. The revelation that would change everything came during a conversation Nathaniel wasn't supposed to hear. He'd returned home early from a business dinner, arriving just as Ruby was finishing a phone call with her mother. She'd been speaking in rapid Spanish, her voice animated in ways he rarely heard when she spoke English. Nathaniel's Spanish was limited, but functional, enough to understand that Ruby was describing her life in terms that bore little resemblance to their actual arrangement. She spoke of Nathaniel with obvious affection, of Oliver with genuine maternal love, and of their life together as if it were everything she'd ever dreamed of having. She was telling her mother the story Ruby wished were true, and hearing it made Nathaniel realize how much he wished it were true as well. When Ruby ended the call and found him standing in the kitchen, her face had gone carefully blank in the way it did whenever she felt exposed. "I'm sorry," she'd said automatically. "I didn't know you were home." "Ruby," Nathaniel had started, but she'd already begun backing toward the hallway, retreating behind the professional distance that had defined their entire relationship. "I should check on Oliver," she'd said, fleeing before he could find words for the conversation they'd been avoiding for months. That night, Nathaniel lay awake thinking about the warmth in Ruby's voice when she spoke about their life, the love she'd managed to find in an arrangement that was supposed to be purely transactional. She'd somehow turned their business relationship into something real, at least on her side, and he'd been too blind to see it happening. More importantly, he'd been too frightened to admit that he wanted it to be real for him too. The final year of their contract approached like a deadline neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Their life together had settled into rhythms that felt natural and sustainable, built on mutual respect and genuine care for Oliver's well-being. They functioned like a real family in every way, except the one that mattered most. Nathaniel found himself dreading the conversation about renewal or separation that their contract required. He'd spent months hoping Ruby would bring up the subject, giving him an opening to confess that somewhere along the way, their arrangement had become the most important relationship in his life. But Ruby remained professionally distant about their future, treating their approaching deadline with the same careful neutrality she brought to all aspects of their marriage. If she had feelings about their arrangement ending, she kept them hidden behind the same polite reserve that had protected her throughout their entire relationship. As their third anniversary approached, Nathaniel realized he'd run out of time to find the courage for honesty. The end came not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet resignation. Ruby had been accepted to a master's program that would allow her to expand her work with immigrant families, an opportunity that represented everything she'd been working toward since their marriage began. She'd presented it to him as a practical matter, explaining that their contract was ending anyway, and this would allow her to transition to independent life with purpose and direction. She'd saved money from her allowance, supplemented by the work Nathaniel had pretended not to know about, enough to support herself through graduate school without relying on the generous settlement their contract provided. "It's time," she'd said simply, showing him the acceptance letter with quiet pride. "Oliver is settled and happy. Your mother has accepted me. I've served my purpose here." Nathaniel had wanted to argue that her purpose had become so much more than their original agreement, that losing her would leave gaps in their lives that couldn't be filled by any amount of money or contractual obligation. But Ruby's careful composure made it clear that she'd already decided their story was ending. "Oliver will miss you," he'd said instead, which was true, but inadequate. "He'll be fine," Ruby had replied, with the gentle firmness she used when Oliver tried to avoid difficult truths. "He's stronger than he knows." The parallel hadn't been lost on Nathaniel. Ruby thought he'd be fine without her, too, that their relationship had been nothing more than a useful arrangement that had served its purpose. She couldn't see that somewhere along the way he'd fallen in love with the woman who'd turned their house into a home and their son into the happiest version of himself. Ruby's departure had been planned with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She'd organized her belongings, arranged for a smooth transition of Oliver's care, and prepared to disappear from their lives as quietly as she'd entered them. The night before she was scheduled to leave, Nathaniel found her packing in the bedroom that had never really felt like hers despite 3 years of occupation. She'd been careful not to take anything that hadn't belonged to her originally, leaving behind the beautiful clothes and jewelry he'd provided as part of their arrangement. "You don't have to leave it all behind," he'd said, watching her fold the simple dresses that had somehow become more elegant than designer gowns simply because she wore them. "It was never really mine," Ruby had replied without looking at him. "I'd rather start fresh with things I've earned myself." The words had stung more than she could have intended, carrying the implication that nothing about their life together had been real enough for her to want to keep. Nathaniel had stood in her doorway, wanting to say everything he'd been too proud or too frightened to admit over the past year. He'd wanted to tell her that she'd earned more than clothes or jewelry, that she'd earned a place in their family that couldn't be replaced by any future arrangement. He'd wanted to ask her to stay, not because their contract required it, but because losing her would break something in him that had just begun to heal. Instead, he'd wished her luck and closed the door on 3 years of the closest thing to happiness he'd known since Oliver was born. Oliver's reaction to Ruby's leaving had been heartbreaking and predictable. The 8-year-old couldn't understand why someone who loved him would choose to go away, couldn't grasp the adult complications that made their arrangement temporary. "Did I do something wrong?" he'd asked through tears, clinging to Ruby during their final goodbye. "I can be better, I promise." Ruby had held him with fierce tenderness, her own tears finally breaking through the composed facade she'd maintained throughout her departure preparations. "You are perfect exactly as you are," she'd whispered. "This isn't about you, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have to make choices that don't make sense to anyone else." Watching them say goodbye had been the hardest thing Nathaniel had ever done. He'd seen how much Ruby loved his son, how much Oliver needed her presence in his life, and how their separation was hurting them both. Yet he'd been powerless to stop it, trapped by pride and 3 years of pretending their relationship was nothing more than a business transaction. After Ruby left, the penthouse had felt hollow despite being filled with all the same furniture and possessions. Oliver retreated into himself, grieving the loss of the only mother figure he'd really known. Nathaniel threw himself into work, trying to ignore the ways Ruby's absence highlighted everything that had been meaningful about her presence. Months passed before Nathaniel admitted to himself that Ruby had been right about one thing. Oliver was stronger than they'd known. His son gradually adjusted to life without Ruby, though he still mentioned her regularly and kept a drawing she'd helped him make prominently displayed in his room. But Nathaniel found no such resilience in himself. Ruby's absence felt like a constant ache, a reminder of everything he'd been too stubborn to fight for when he'd had the chance. He'd kept track of her progress through the private investigator he'd hired to ensure her safety, though he'd never acted on the information. Ruby was thriving in graduate school, excelling in her studies and expanding her work with immigrant communities. She'd started a small non-profit organization focused on family integration services, funded in part by the settlement from their marriage contract. She was building exactly the kind of meaningful life she'd dreamed of, independent and purposeful and completely separate from him. The realization that Ruby was better off without him should have brought Nathaniel peace, but it only made him more aware of how much worse off he was without her. The decision to pursue Ruby came not from grand romantic gesture, but from Oliver's quiet persistence. His son had never stopped asking when Ruby might visit, never stopped mentioning her in prayers and casual conversation. One evening, as they sat through another awkward dinner in their too-quiet home, Oliver had looked up from his untouched plate and asked the question that changed everything. "Dad, do you miss Ruby too?" The simple honesty in his son's voice had stripped away 3 years of pretense and protective indifference. Nathaniel had looked at Oliver's hopeful face and realized that his pride had cost them both the person who'd made their family complete. "Yes," he'd admitted, the word feeling like both confession and liberation. "I miss her very much." "Then why don't we ask her to come back?" Oliver had said, with the uncomplicated logic of childhood. "Maybe she misses us too." It had taken Nathaniel weeks to find the courage to act on his son's suggestion, but when he finally did, he approached Ruby's return the way he approached everything else in his life, with careful planning and total commitment. He didn't want to simply ask Ruby to resume their old arrangement. She deserved better than a contract marriage, even an improved one. She deserved to be courted properly, to be pursued by a man who could offer her genuine love rather than convenient security. Nathaniel had spent the better part of a year learning to become that man. He'd started therapy, confronting the emotional damage that had made him cruel to innocent women and blind to Ruby's genuine worth. He'd learned to identify the fear and anger that had driven his worst behavior, and more importantly, he'd learned strategies for responding differently when those emotions surfaced. He'd also begun the process of truly healing his relationship with Oliver, acknowledging the ways his son had suffered from having an emotionally unavailable father. They'd grown closer over the months since Ruby left, bonding over their shared sense of loss and their mutual commitment to becoming better versions of themselves. When Nathaniel finally felt ready to pursue Ruby properly, he'd started small. Flowers delivered to her apartment with no note, just a simple acknowledgement that he was thinking of her. Books related to her studies, sent anonymously but selected with the kind of careful attention that only someone who knew her well could provide. Ruby had been suspicious at first, probably assuming the gifts were from a fellow student or professor who'd taken interest in her work. But gradually, the presents had become more personal, more clearly connected to their shared history. A framed photo of Oliver had been accompanied by a note in his son's careful handwriting. "Ruby, I drew you a picture of our family. You're still in it because you're still in our hearts." That gift had prompted Ruby's first direct contact in over a year, a brief phone call to thank them and ensure Oliver was doing well. Her voice had been carefully neutral, but Nathaniel had heard the longing beneath her professional courtesy. It had been enough encouragement to continue. The courtship that followed had been unlike anything Nathaniel had ever experienced. Instead of the calculated seduction he'd used in business and his first marriage, he'd approached Ruby with genuine humility and patience. He'd made no demands, applied no pressure, simply tried to demonstrate through consistent actions that he'd become worthy of her consideration. He'd attended her public presentations at the university, sitting in the back row to listen to her speak about immigrant family integration with passion and expertise he'd never fully appreciated during their marriage. He'd made donations to her non-profit organization, carefully structured to support her work without creating obligation. Most importantly, he'd given her space to continue building the independent life she'd created, making it clear that his interest in reconciliation wasn't about returning to their old arrangement, but about creating something entirely new. The breakthrough had come during one of Oliver's school events, a science fair where his son had created a project about family structures around the world. Ruby had been there as a guest speaker, discussing her work with immigrant families, when she'd noticed Oliver's display. Nathaniel had watched from across the room as Ruby studied his son's project, her face soft with obvious affection as she read Oliver's conclusions about what made families strong. When Oliver noticed her presence, his face had lit up with joy that had made several nearby parents smile. "Ruby! You came!" Oliver had shouted, forgetting his surroundings in his excitement. The reunion had been tender and natural, Ruby's reserve melting away as Oliver showed her everything he'd learned and accomplished in the months since she'd left. Nathaniel had approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on their connection but unable to stay away. "Hello, Nathaniel," Ruby had said quietly when she'd finally noticed him, her voice carefully neutral but her eyes warm. "Hello, Ruby," he'd replied. And somehow those simple words had carried the weight of everything he'd been trying to say for months. They'd talked for nearly an hour at the science fair, their conversation flowing with the easy familiarity of people who'd once shared daily life. Ruby had asked about his work, his family, the small details of existence that she'd once managed so carefully. Nathaniel had listened to her describe her studies and her non-profit work, marveling at how much she'd accomplished in such a short time. When Oliver won second place in his category, Ruby had cheered as loudly as any parent, her pride in his achievement obvious to everyone watching. The moment had felt so natural, so much like the family celebrations they'd shared during their marriage, that Nathaniel had felt a surge of hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. "Would you like to have dinner with us?" he'd asked as they prepared to leave the school, his voice carefully casual despite the weight of the invitation. "Oliver's been wanting to show you his room. He's redecorated since you left." Ruby had hesitated, her eyes moving between father and son with obvious conflict. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she'd said softly. "Please, Ruby," Oliver had added, his 8-year-old diplomacy more effective than any argument Nathaniel could have made. "I made something for you. It's been waiting in my room for months." The gift had been a photo album Oliver had created himself, filled with pictures from their 3 years as a family and drawings he'd made to fill in the gaps where no photographs existed. The final page contained a drawing of the 3 of them together, with a carefully lettered message. "This is my real family. Love, Oliver." Ruby had cried reading it, the first time Nathaniel had seen her. Emotional walls completely collapsed since the night she'd left. "Oh, sweetheart," she'd whispered, pulling Oliver into a hug that lasted several minutes. That evening had marked the beginning of their second courtship, though neither of them had acknowledged it directly. Ruby began accepting invitations for family dinners, afternoon outings with Oliver, and eventually private conversations with Nathaniel that lasted well into the evening. They talked about everything they'd avoided during their marriage. Nathaniel's reasons for being cruel to his previous dates, Ruby's feelings about being chosen as a sacrificial lamb, the ways their arrangement had evolved into something neither had expected. The conversations were sometimes painful, always honest, and gradually healing for both of them. "I was so angry when I realized what the matchmaker had done," Ruby admitted one evening as they sat in Nathaniel's study, Oliver asleep upstairs after another successful family dinner. "Not just at her, but at you. You could have warned me what I was walking into." "You're right," Nathaniel had replied without defensiveness. "I should have. I was so focused on my own pain that I didn't consider yours. That's not an excuse, just an explanation." Ruby had studied his face in the lamplight, searching for sincerity she'd learned not to trust during their marriage. "What changed? Why are you here now, saying things you never said then?" "Losing you changed everything," Nathaniel had answered with the kind of raw honesty that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. "I didn't realize what our marriage had become until it was gone. You turned our house into a home, our son into the happiest version of himself, and me into someone I didn't hate looking at in the mirror. That was never my job," Ruby had said quietly. "No, it wasn't. Which is why it meant so much when it happened anyway." These conversations had continued for months, building trust that had been absent from their original relationship. Ruby began to believe that Nathaniel's interest in reconciliation was genuine rather than convenient, while Nathaniel learned to express emotions he'd spent years suppressing. The shift from friendship to something deeper had been gradual but unmistakable. Hands that had briefly touched while passing dishes began to linger. Conversations that had been carefully neutral began to carry undertones of affection and desire. The careful distance they'd maintained started to feel artificial rather than protective. The night everything changed had been ordinary in every way except its conclusion. They'd shared dinner as a family, helped Oliver with homework, and settled into their usual evening routine of adult conversation after his bedtime. But instead of Ruby leaving at a reasonable hour, as she'd done for months, she'd fallen asleep on the couch while they talked. Nathaniel had covered her with a blanket and prepared to sleep in a chair rather than wake her, but Ruby had stirred as he'd adjusted the covering around her shoulders. "I should go home," she'd murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "Stay," Nathaniel had replied, the word carrying more meaning than either of them had been ready to acknowledge. "Please stay." Ruby had looked at him in the dim light, her expression unguarded in a way it hadn't been since their wedding day. "Nathaniel, I know we agreed to take things slowly," he'd said, sitting beside her on the couch. "I know we're still figuring out what this is between us. But I can't keep pretending that what I feel for you is friendship or gratitude or anything less than love." The word had hung between them like a bridge neither had been sure they were ready to cross. "You love me?" Ruby had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've loved you for longer than I was brave enough to admit," Nathaniel had replied. "Maybe since that first dinner when you thanked the waiter in Spanish and he smiled like you'd made his entire evening. Maybe since the night I found you asleep outside Oliver's room. Maybe since I realized that you'd turned a business arrangement into the closest thing to happiness I'd ever known." Ruby had been quiet for a long moment, her eyes searching his face in the lamplight. "I loved you too," she'd finally admitted. "During our marriage. I loved you and Oliver and the life we built together, even though I knew it wasn't real for you. It was real," Nathaniel had said, taking her hand with the same reverence he'd shown when placing the wedding ring on her finger 3 years earlier. "I just didn't know how to admit it. I'd spent so long protecting myself from feeling anything that I almost missed the best thing that ever happened to me." The kiss that followed had been tentative at first, both of them aware that they were crossing a line that would change everything between them. But when Ruby had responded with matching hunger, when her arms had come around his neck with the familiarity of someone who belonged there, Nathaniel had known they were finally building something real. They'd spent the night talking until dawn, sharing the intimate conversations that should have happened during their marriage. Ruby told him about the loneliness she'd felt being married to someone who couldn't see her as more than an employee. Nathaniel explained the fear that had made him cruel to other women and blind to her worth. Most importantly, they talked about the future they wanted to build together, one based on genuine partnership rather than contractual obligation. "I want to marry you again," Nathaniel had said, as the sun rose over the city skyline. "Really marry you this time. No contracts, no conditions, just a promise to love each other through whatever comes." "What about Oliver?" Ruby had asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of romantic declaration. "Oliver's been asking me to marry you again since the day you left," Nathaniel had replied with a laugh. "I think he'll approve." Ruby had smiled then, the radiant expression he'd fallen in love with, but had seen too rarely during their first marriage. "Then yes," she'd said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you again." The second proposal had been everything the first one wasn't: private, genuine, and born from love rather than desperation. Nathaniel had waited until they were all together as a family, Oliver helping Ruby prepare dinner in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. "Oliver," Nathaniel had said, getting down on his son's level, how would you feel if I asked Ruby to marry us again? Really marry us this time, because we love each other." Oliver's face had lit up with joy that made both adults tear up. "Can we have a big party? And can Ruby wear a pretty dress? And can I be the ring bearer again? We can have whatever kind of wedding makes Ruby happy," Nathaniel had promised, looking up at the woman who'd taught him that love was about putting someone else's happiness before your own pride. The second wedding had been everything their first hadn't been allowed to be. Ruby's parents had cried tears of joy instead of confusion. Helen Reed had embraced her daughter-in-law with genuine warmth. Oliver had carried the rings with solemn importance, understanding now that he was witnessing something magical rather than obligatory. But the most important difference had been in the vows themselves. Instead of legal formalities, they'd spoken from their hearts about the journey that had brought them to genuine love. "I promise to see you," Nathaniel had said, his voice strong despite his emotion. "Not as a convenience or a solution to my problems, but as the remarkable woman you are. I promise to earn your love every day, not take it for granted because of a contract or a ring." Ruby's vows had been equally honest. "I promise to trust your love, even when my own insecurities make me doubt it. I promise to be your partner, not your employee. And I promise to help you remember that you deserve happiness, even when you forget it yourself. The reception had been filled with laughter and dancing and the kind of joy that comes from authentic celebration. Ruby had worn a dress she'd chosen herself, one that made her feel beautiful rather than appropriate. Oliver had given a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how families were made of love rather than blood or contracts. But perhaps the most meaningful moment had come when Margaret Thornfield approached them during the reception, her face filled with the kind of guilt that had been eating at her for years. "I owe you both an apology," she'd said, her voice thick with regret. "What I did, setting you up the way I did, was cruel and unforgivable. I justified it by telling myself you were both adults who could make your own choices, but I knew exactly what I was doing." Ruby had listened with the same dignity she brought to everything difficult in her life. "You were desperate," she'd said finally. "We all do things we're ashamed of when we feel like we're out of options." "That doesn't excuse it," Margaret had insisted. "But seeing you both now, seeing what you've built together despite my manipulation, maybe something good came from something terrible." Nathaniel had put his arm around his wife, marveling at her capacity for forgiveness. "Ruby has a gift for turning broken things into something beautiful," he'd said. "It's what she did with our family." As the evening had wound down and they'd prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a real one this time, to a destination Ruby had chosen, Oliver had hugged them both with the fierce affection of a child who finally understood that his family was secure. "I'm glad you guys figured out how to love each other," he'd said with 8-year-old wisdom. "It's way better when families stick together because they want to, not because they have to." Standing there with his wife and son, surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated their happiness, Nathaniel had realized that Oliver was right about more than just their family. Everything in life was better when it was chosen rather than obligated, when it came from love rather than fear. The matchmaker had set Ruby up as a joke, expecting her to become another casualty in Nathaniel's war against emotional vulnerability. Instead, she'd become the catalyst for his healing, the bridge between the man he'd been and the man he was capable of becoming. Their love story hadn't begun with the fairy tale proposal that had shocked a restaurant full of strangers. It had begun in the quiet moments afterward, when two damaged people had chosen to believe that love was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. And perhaps that was the most beautiful twist of all. Sometimes the cruelest setups led to the most genuine happy endings, when people were brave enough to choose love over self-protection, hope over cynicism, and truth over the comfortable lies that kept them safe, but alone. Ruby Martinez had taught Nathaniel Reed that love wasn't about perfect moments or grand gestures. It was about showing up every day and choosing to see the best in someone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. It was about building something real from the fragments of something broken, and trusting that genuine connection was worth the risk of being hurt. As they drove away from their wedding reception, Ruby's hand warm in his, and Oliver chattering excitedly about their upcoming family vacation, Nathaniel reflected on how differently their story could have ended. A less forgiving woman might have walked away after discovering the cruel joke that had brought them together. A less courageous man might have let pride prevent him from admitting his mistakes and fighting for love. But Ruby Martinez had been both strong enough to leave when she deserved better, and generous enough to return when he'd finally learned to offer it. And Nathaniel Reed had been both humble enough to acknowledge his failures and determined enough to become worthy of her second chance. Their marriage had begun as the punchline to someone else's cruel joke. But love, as Ruby had taught him, had a way of writing its own endings, turning even the most unlikely beginnings into stories worth celebrating. The man who had once turned rejecting women into an art form had discovered something far more valuable: the art of loving someone so completely that their happiness became more important than his own pride. And the woman who had been chosen as a sacrifice had become instead a savior, transforming not just one bitter man, but an entire family's understanding of what love could accomplish. Sometimes the best love stories weren't the ones that began with perfect circumstances, but the ones where imperfect people chose to become better versions of themselves for each other. Ruby and Nathaniel's story was proof that even the cruelest setups could lead to the most beautiful endings when people were willing to believe that love was stronger than the forces that tried to destroy it. And as their car disappeared into the night, carrying them toward a future built on genuine affection rather than contractual obligation, the restaurant where their story had begun hosted another blind date, another chance for two strangers to discover whether they might become something more. Because love, like hope, had a way of perpetuating itself, inspiring others to believe in possibilities they might never have imagined on their own. The matchmaker had set her up as a joke, but Ruby Martinez had gotten the last laugh, after all, not through revenge or bitterness, but through the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, forgiveness over resentment, and hope over the safer option of cynical solitude. In the end, that was the real twist that had frozen everyone in that upscale restaurant. Not that a cruel man had proposed to an innocent woman, but that love had found a way to bloom even in the most poisoned soil, proving that genuine connection was possible even when it seemed impossible. And perhaps that was the lesson their story offered to anyone brave enough to listen. Sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the ugliest beginnings, when people choose to see possibility where others see only problems, and when they're willing to fight for love even when love seems determined to elude them. Ruby and Nathaniel Reed had learned that love wasn't about perfect people finding each other under perfect circumstances. It was about imperfect people choosing to become better together, day by day, choice by choice, until something beautiful emerged from something that had once seemed irredeemably broken. That was the real magic behind their fairy tale ending. Not that everything had been easy, but that they'd made it look easy by choosing love over pride, understanding over judgment, and hope over the fear that had once kept them both trapped in lives smaller than their hearts deserved